Well, I have been now involved over 50 years of researching a very important subgroup of non-ordinary states of consciousness that I call holotropic. That holotropic is my name. It's a composite word. It's a name that I gave a group of non-ordinary states that have healing potential, that have transformative potential, I believe also evolutionary potential, and then heuristic, that's H-E-U-R, which means when you experience these states or you study, research these states, you get new revolutionary information about the human psyche, about consciousness, and even nature of reality. So those are states, just to make it a little clearer, those are states, for example, that the shamans experience as part of their initiatory crisis, and that they then use when they work with their clients. These are also the states that are induced in so-called rites of passage of native cultures, which are rituals that these cultures perform at the time of some important biological and social transitions, such as birth of a child, or circumcision, or puberty, marriage, menopause, dying. Those are also states that were described in the context of the mysteries of death and rebirth in different parts of the world, in Sumer, in Egypt, and Greece, in Asia Minor, even in Mesoamerica. So those were rituals when they were using various means to change consciousness, and people were experiencing these non-ordinary states mostly in the form of psychospiritual death and rebirth. And then also the states described by people practicing different forms of yoga, different schools of Buddhism, Taoism, Kabbalah, Christian mysticism, So this is a special category of non-ordinary states. And I was just astounded that current psychiatry, psychology don't have a special name for them. So since I believe that they should have a name, I just made one myself. Part of it is biological, I think, just the passage through the birth canal and the challenges which are associated with it, the pain and the choking and so on, creates a kind of a separating barrier from them. But then the kind of upbringing that we have in industrial civilization, where these states are not appreciated, they are even outlawed. Some of the means and some of the contexts for them are outlawed. That is very different from some of the native cultures that would actually value these states, and they would sort of encourage it in children, and they would offer rituals in which people regularly during their lifetime could have experiences of these states. Well, I think I was just at the right time in the right place. I was working at the psychiatric clinic in Prague, and I was at a state where I was getting disappointed with psychoanalysis, which was my reason why I studied medicine. And then we finished a large study of Mellaril, which was one of the early tranquilizers, and that came from Switzerland, from Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company. And when you have a good relationship with pharmaceutical companies, you get all kinds of fringe benefits, free literature or trip to a conference, and also samples of substances that they develop. And so as part of this cooperation, we got a large box full of ampules, and it says LSD 25. And it came with a letter describing the history, very interesting history, that this was a very powerful psychoactive substance, and that the effects of it were discovered by Dr. Hoffman, who actually accidentally intoxicated himself when he was working with this substance. And they did some preliminary studies, and they felt that this substance, incredibly small quantities of millions of a gram, can produce powerful changes, emotional changes, mental changes, that were very similar to what we see in certain categories of patients. And so they were asking us if we would like to work with that substance and let them know if there was any legitimate use for that. And they were actually giving two tips. One was that they felt this could be used to induce an experimental psychosis, which means you would give it to quote-unquote normal people and do all kinds of measurements, psychological tests, biochemical tests, electrophysiological tests, before, during, and after, and you would get insight as to what's happening biologically when the mental functioning of people is so profoundly influenced. And it's always great to have a model in science. But there was another tip which kind of became my destiny, or my karma, if you want. It said that they felt that maybe this could be used as a kind of unconventional educational tool, that psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, students could take it and spend a few hours in the kind of world that some of their patients lived in, and as a result of it be able to understand them better, to communicate more effectively, and hopefully be more successful in their treatment, which was kind of sorely needed in psychiatry at the time. You know, psychiatry was really medieval. We were using electroshocks and cardiazol shocks and insulin comas, and dunking patients in cold water and stuff. So this was very, very exciting, and so I volunteered, and I had just an extremely powerful experience. So this was my introduction into this world of holotropic states, although I didn't call them holotropic at the time. It was particularly powerful because my preceptor was very interested in electroencephalography, and at the time when I had the session, he was particularly interested in something that's called driving the brain waves, which means exposing people to very powerful stroboscopic light, and then studying if the brain waves in the suboccipital area, which is the optical cortex, would pick up the frequency that you're feeding in. So what it meant is that in the middle of my session, when my experience was culminating, this research assistant came and she said it was time to drive the brainwaves. So she took me to a small room. I lie down and she pasted the electrodes on my head, and then brought this gigantic stroboscopic light and then turned it on. And in the next moment, there was light like I had never seen in my life. I couldn't even imagine existed. At the time, I thought this is what it must have been like in Hiroshima. Today, I think it was more like Dharmakaya, with the primary clear light from the Tibetan Book of the Dead that you're supposed to see at the moment of your death. And my consciousness was just catapulted out of my body, and I lost the research assistant, I lost the clinic, I lost Prague, I lost the planet. And I had the feeling that I ceased to exist in the form in which I knew myself. I was just extinguished. But I somehow became everything there was. I was kind of nothing and everything at the same time. And it was quite an incredible experience. And then as this was happening to me, she was very carefully following the protocol. She started from 2 hertz, went up to 60 hertz, and then back and left it for a while in the alpha range, and then in the middle of the theta range and the delta range, and then turn it off, and then my consciousness started shrinking again. And for a while I was actually in the astronomical universe, and processes were happening for which I didn't have names even at the time. Later, when I read about the black holes and white holes and wormholes, it was something in that category. And then I sort of returned. I found the planet. I found the clinic. I found my body. But for a while, it was difficult for me to align my consciousness with my body, and it just became clear to me that those are two different things, and that the idea that consciousness is produced by the brain simply was nonsense. And I was very impressed, and suddenly I had a whole new realm that I wanted to explore. I was stuck with psychiatry, and I felt this was by far the most interesting thing that you can study. So it has been now about 54 years, and I have really done very little professionally that would not be related in one way or another to these holotropic states. Well, to me, it just became clear with that experience, and then, many experiences I had later, that consciousness is a cosmic phenomenon. This is just part of existence. This is not something that is created in our head, in our brain. And so I looked back at the evidence that we have, because there's a claim that we have proven, beyond any doubt, that consciousness is coming out of the brain. And I realized it's not true. If you look at it, we have an enormous number of experiments and observations, clinical observations, indicating that there are very close correlations between the anatomy, physiology, biochemistry of the brain and states of consciousness. But none of it is really a proof that consciousness comes actually out of the, out of the brain. It would be like saying, because there are correlations between the quality of the sound and the picture in the television and the components in the set, is a proof that the whole program is generated in the box. So I don't question the relevance of the observations suggesting correlations, narrow correlations, but I certainly question the conclusions that were made. This is, in formal logic, you call it non sequitur. It doesn't really follow. It still certainly opens another possibility or other possibilities, suggesting that consciousness mediates. I mean, the brain mediates consciousness, but it does not generate it. If you just look at the whole range of worlds that you can experience in these states, the idea that this would be produced by some pathological process, in interaction with consciousness, simply doesn't make sense. Because there is so much beauty, so much sort of artistic quality, that in those inner worlds, that the idea that those are pathological products simply doesn't make any sense. Well, I think there's already enormous amount of evidence. Certainly we have direct evidence that, for example, consciousness is doing things that the brain cannot possibly do. Just to mention one of many would be the whole area of observations in near-death situations, where the person can be in a state of cardiac death or even have flat EEG, and the consciousness is sort of out of the body and is observing the procedure of resuscitation, or decides to go for a little trip and checks what's happening in other rooms of that building, or goes through the ceilings and observes the environment of the hospital, or experiences something that's thousands of miles away. And we have now even observations showing that people congenitally blind for organic reasons can see when their consciousness gets out of the body. So we have enormous number now of what traditional science calls anomalous phenomena, which means something that current science cannot explain. And historically, this has been a reason to change the paradigm. If there's just too much that you cannot explain, the paradigm has a problem. One of the definitions of anomalous phenomena is what is left when you apply a bad theory. So I think all this is an indication that we need some radical change. And I believe that in the future there will not be any conflict between science properly understood and spirituality properly understood. We are not trying in transpersonal psychology to put together dogmas of organized religions and science, whether it's Cartesian Newtonian science or new paradigm science. But there is no reason why we couldn't study transpersonal experiences, describe the phenomenology, describe the impact that it has on people, and also the challenging observations that you do when you study these the paradigm challenges that happen. Well, I think we have the situation where in the West, we have put a lot of emphasis on psychological studies, and with a few exceptions, we are missing the understanding of spirituality. And in the East, they focused on the spiritual part, but not on the study of psychology. And I think we are in a situation now where we can really have a comprehensive system that integrates both the psychological and the spiritual component. And once we have that, we will not need transpersonal psychology. We will not need parapsychology. Once we have correct understanding of the psyche, it's just going to be psychology. Why parapsychology? There are this extrasensory access to information with many types of transpersonal experiences. So why narrow that research to, telepathy and psychometry and maybe out-of-body experiences? Once we acknowledge the dimensions of the psyche and the real potential of the psyche, we don't need these para. The para means that's a discipline where there seems to be enough evidence to ignore it, but not enough evidence so that it's incorporated as just part of the knowledge of the psyche. The same transpersonal, why should we have special discipline, transpersonal psychology? What should happen is that psychology acknowledges that there is a transpersonal dimension to the psyche, and then it's just psychology, it's not transpersonal psychology. Our daughter is married to a man whose mother is Native American from the Ojibwe tradition. And so we have had this wonderful discussions. And she told me, Stan, I don't know why you call these states non-ordinary. For my people, it is just part of the spectrum of experiences that people can have, So here I thought I was somewhat avant-garde, in the academic circles, but for her this was a very narrow sort of understanding to make the distinction there, because it's really a continuum. And, there are states where the sort of the transpersonal dimension is stronger, and others where it's just slightly sort of indicated. But there are many experiences that certainly are somewhere, on the interface. I mean, when you are the person at least a little sensitive, and you go and see the Grand Canyon or a rainbow or Aurora Borealis, or listen to Beethoven's symphony, you will be very, very far into the transpersonal realm, or what is called transpersonal now. Well, in my understanding, psychedelics are catalysts. They just basically make it possible for you to experience some of the deeper dimensions of the psyche. So for me, they are tools that can be used for self-exploration without any kind of special clinical focus. They can be used for treatment of emotional psychosomatic disorders. At the same time, they have an aesthetic dimension that certainly is something that is of interest to artists. And then, as you are going to the roots of your problems, whether it's self-exploration or actually therapy, then sooner or later the spiritual dimension in the psyche opens. These experiences will get a quality that Jung called numinosity. You are going to be in the realm of the sacred, if you want to call it that way. But it's a direct experience. It's nothing to do with belief. There's a wonderful discussion that Jung had and after he was about 80 years old, and it was released. It's called Face to Face, that interview. And at one point the interviewer asked him, "Dr. Jung, do you believe in God?" And Jung said, "No." And so Jungians, when they watch it, say, "What? Jung didn't believe in God?" And then Jung makes a kind of dramatic pause, and then he says, "I know. I had the experience of being grabbed by something that was far bigger than myself." So I think what he said was very interesting. If you have to say, "I believe in God," or "I don't believe in God," or "I believe in reincarnation," or "don't believe in reincarnation," you can just forget it. You don't have really anything to go by. Once you have the experience of the divine, or you have the experience of past lives, you know that the experiences are real. You have experiential knowledge of these realms. You wouldn't call it belief. I think that the dying process is going to be a very, very interesting journey. I am not very excited about physical suffering that comes with it. I think I can handle better, experiences than when it has real sort of physical correlates. Some of the native cultures have really drastic procedures to induce non-ordinary states, like the Lakota Sioux, the sun dance with the hooks going through the pectoral muscles, or the Mandan Indians from the plains had the Okipa ceremony, which is not just these hooks through the pectoral muscles, but also hooks through the gluteal muscles, and they kind of rotate you until it's torn out, and then you have to run around until you lose the buffalo skulls, which are on these hooks on the buttocks, and then if you sort of feign that they drag you around until the skulls fall off, and then they treat this person like a baby. Sort of they comfort them and feed them milk and so on. So I have had pretty drastic experiences, but I would rather leave the body out of it. It's not my kind of thing to, you know, when it gets to mutilation and real body damage and so on. So I have kind of somewhat mixed feelings. I've seen sort of, you know, having a medical background, I've seen people going through states which were more than just the experience of dying, where it involved, you know, really pretty drastic sort of changes in the body that I certainly would not be looking forward to. Well, it definitely is a training for dying, but I think it's still more effective for the experiential part, you know, than the one that's associated with some real physical damage. We have seen changes even in experience of pain, for example, in cancer patients, but that was induced by psychedelics. You know, where people lost fear, sometimes lost fear of death, but sometimes also pain, and not just for the time of the effect of the psychedelic, but sometimes for a couple of weeks. So. I have tried DMT, and even something that was more interesting, that was methoxy DMT. I think that's an amazing substance. It's found in the snuffs in the Caribbean and in South America, and then also in the parotid glands of a certain kind of a toad called Bufo alvarius. And that's an amazing substance. It's somewhat longer than DMT. DMT is, you know, too short, and it takes you very deep. I described that experience in my book, When the Impossible Happens. It's a chapter called The Secret of the Toad of Light. That was basically my most powerful psychedelic experience ever. And I think there's also, if there were openness in the academic circle, this would be really substance to use therapeutically, because it can take you very deep. It does not last too long, you know, for an average clinician to be with the clients for 6 hours. It's not very practical. So this cuts it to a workable duration, and also it seems to be the closure seems to be cleaner, you know. Of course, you know, you need open-minded academic circles, and that's going to take a while. It's kind of amazing how we accepted, you know, certain drastic procedures, and we have such problems with psychedelics. I don't know if you know that the only Nobel Prize that was given that has any relevance for psychiatry was given for lobotomy. Edgar Moniz, a Portuguese, you know, neurosurgeon. Not even that finer form, but this was transorbital. This was like making a hole in the temple. You put a knife there, scalpel, and you cut off, you know, the frontal lobe, basically. So there were less problems accepting lobotomy than there had been accepting psychedelics. You see, I think the psychedelics just expand the range of human experience enormously. And I think both of those extremes are scary. One is really the fact that it can open up the dark areas. We just don't want to look there. We have sort of a very meek psychology, like where the problems are what happened during nursing or toilet training, or seeing your parents having intercourse in the bedroom, and then we surprised when suddenly there's Nazism and the things that are happening in Tibet or in Iraq and so on. So there are areas in our unconscious that get activated in these kinds of events, the Holocaust and so on, where suddenly a whole nation can sort of go wild. And then the other one is that we are kind of a Victorian culture. We have low tolerance for the ecstatic part, or things like sexual freedom and so on, things that were happening. So it's sort of rocking the boat of a kind of a civilization that remains within certain limits, and there's a discipline and control. I think there were additional things in the 60s that the hippies changed their outer appearance. They were wearing beards and long hair and funny uniforms, and they were very easily identifiable as the troublemakers. They were the ones who were protesting the war in Vietnam and so on, and sort of violating some of the norms. If they were sort of walking around with white shirts and ties, it would be a little more difficult. So I think they made themselves a target because they were so easily identifiable. So I think those are the more superficial problems. The deeper problem, I think, is really spiritual. And I wrote about it in the book, The Cosmic Game. That you can get an insight in these states that what we are experiencing is like a divine play. The Hindus talk about Leela and so on. And from that perspective, if you suddenly have a tool that makes you to see through that whole game, it would be spoiled. So when that tool appears, it has to be counterbalanced. Suddenly you have flashbacks and prolonged reactions, and then it becomes illegal, and somebody jumped out of the window and so on. So it just sort of thickens the plot, which is something that Ramakrishna used. I like that term, that thickens the plot, but doesn't sort of offer very easy escape from the play. So I think that's probably a very deep reason for that. That kind of tool has to be given just in small dosages, because otherwise you could just see through the whole thing too easily. It can be used in many, many different ways. It can be used for people who don't have any obvious clinical problems, because there's always place for improvement or expansion. So then it's a very, very powerful tool if it's properly used with the proper set and setting for medical, psychiatric problems that cannot be really handled otherwise. We don't have really very effective tools in psychiatry. In psychiatry, mostly these days, it's symptomatic suppression, which is called therapy. Now, in medicine, you would use symptomatic treatment only in two situations. One is if you simultaneously do something that goes to the causes of the problem, and you still want to give some relief of the symptoms, then you combine it with symptomatic treatment, or you use symptomatic treatment if these are incurable diseases, if you don't know what to do more effectively. So what we are doing is trying to find out more and more effective ways of suppressing symptoms without asking the question why the symptoms are what they mean. So it's really treating all these emotional problems as if they were incurable, which is not true. I mean, if you have the right kind of model and right kind of tools, I mean, you can really reach the roots, and you can actually change that condition. Now the problem is that's not very interesting for pharmaceutical companies. You know, pharmaceutical companies need something like Librium or Valium that you have to take 4 times a day for the next 20 years, not something that you would do once a month, and it could actually change things, you know. And the pharmaceutical industry needs something that helps a little, you know, not too much. Then, you know, there are other things I think extremely interesting, the impact on art. Like when we started using psychedelics in Prague, we had many artists who came, and I couldn't go back for 20 years. And when I came back and went to some of the exhibitions of these artists, you could see, I mean, exactly where they took the LSD. I mean, there was a jump, you know, in their artistic expression. I mean, the freedom that they had and how they handled colors and everything. So that's another possibility. The very significant thing is also the spiritual dimension. You know, we have organized religions where you go to church and they tell you about experiences that people had 2,000 years ago. But if somebody would have a really full-blown spiritual experience in a church today, your average minister would probably call a psychiatrist and the ambulance. They would think that this kind of thing doesn't belong to the church. I don't know if you saw the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, when Francis of Assisi has the experience in church and, you know, takes off his clothes and then starts giving the rugs away. You know, the spiritual experiences can be, at least for the time of their duration, can be pretty wild. But it is ultimately something that can give you this spiritual knowledge rather than sort of try to cultivate some belief of a particular creed. And what's more important, that it will make it possible for you to choose the spiritual path that is right for you. It doesn't necessarily. It's not necessarily so that this one way of worshiping is or should be good for everybody. You know. And I think the most interesting way of using psychedelics responsibly would be to actually influence the planetary crisis. That people who have done this work responsibly, they almost change into another species. You know, for them, like, violence is not an acceptable way of solving problems anymore, or it's absolutely you know, unacceptable to destroy nature, to destroy water and air and the soil that's nourishing us. We're biological creatures, so there's no higher imperative than protecting life, creating an environment that protects life. No political, you know, military, ideological reasons or profit, you know, are good enough to override this kind of priority that we should have. And people know that. They have experiences of how deeply we are connected with nature, how we are embedded in nature. And you know, there is a sense of planetary citizenship that comes before being an American or a Czech or a German or whatever. We have a certain common interest here, which is the condition of the planet, so that it can support life. So that should be priorities. People, you don't have to teach people ecology. You don't have to teach them international peace. I mean, when they, to the extent to which they can clear their own traumatic past, they just automatically develop in that direction. I mean, I'm not. I don't want to be an advocate for psychedelics. I'm talking about holotropic states in general. I mean, it can be spiritual practice. It can be, holotropic breathwork. It can be some kind of rituals of native cultures. But some form of these holotropic states that can really change people and under the right circumstances, they're changed in the right direction, I would say. But I would certainly nationalize insurance companies, and I would nationalize pharmaceutical companies. I mean, people should not be making money on somebody's, suffering. And what they are doing, I think, is just horrendous. When they change the patented medicine to generic, it goes to fraction of the cost, and they're still making quite a bit of money. So can you imagine what they are making? I know people where the major part of their income goes to medicines.